What I'm trying to talk about here is whether and how regional policy can help capture gains from foreign direct investment. And again, I think I gave this warning in a smaller session yesterday, but this is a sort of unapologetically normative speech that is, I guess, directed primarily at the partners who may be in the audience. Okay, so what I'm interested in from a normative, from a political point of view, is the question of capturing the good jobs, so you use that sort of simplification, in the production of, in the networks of production which span the globe. And so within the global economic system that we currently have, places, whether we're talking about countries, whether we're talking about provinces, regions, towns, need to try to capture high value-added components of those global production networks in order to create, or to have the possibility of creating, good jobs in the competitive private sector. Now, I've spent a longer time than I care to remember doing research in and around multinational corporations. I'm not, definitely not, trying to give a speech on how one maximizes foreign direct investment, because I don't think that should be a policy aim. So foreign direct investment is good, with the usual scare quotes, to the extent that it helps create and supports good jobs, both within the inward investing firm itself and in the wider regional economy, by helping the region to access global production networks in some way or other. Now this requires, simplifying horrendously, this requires two things. It requires, firstly, it requires strategies for attraction and retention. So nearly every place in the world has some sort of inward investment marketing effort. And it also requires strategies for retention, what's called in the professional community often now investor development. So how publicly sponsored agencies deal with foreign investors that are already in the region, already in the place. Secondly, and obviously, tying back perhaps particularly to what Gerhard was saying, it requires strategies for coordination and capacity building in the local skills and innovation ecosystem, to use a popular phrase there. And very quickly, the evidence base which I'm drawing on here is from well over 200 interviews with multinational corporation unit managers and regional or provincial governance actors, which in some cases are governmental, in other cases social actors, in other cases skills institutions, other things related to education and research, in two regions in each of 4 countries. So the UK, Ireland, Spain and Canada. In the Canadian case, we're looking specifically at regions within Ontario and within Quebec. Obviously, this is not an effort that I did entirely alone. There are several other people in the room who contributed to this effort. I won't limit my time further by naming them all now, but you know who you are. So, if I was to try to give advice to policymakers or people within the system, the first thing, which is relatively obvious, is that, or should be relatively obvious, is that any sort of regional industrial policy or more specifically, any sort of regional inward investment policy, needs to be smart. It needs to focus on firms or sectors or technological processes where the region either already has or has a realistic prospect of developing some kind of regional comparative advantage. So in doing this research across the 8 regions and 4 countries, the first question when visiting firms that one has to, I think, ask, one has to be able to answer, is what is this firm doing? What is this unit doing in this particular place? And we tend to find that when you can't come up with a very convincing answer to that question, that firm may not be there for very long. So answering the sort of why is this here question, particularly if we're talking about giving public support to firms, is very important. And relatedly, in terms of prospecting for inward investment, why should this be here? Why should a particular type of business be located in the Greater Montreal region or in Quebec or wherever? And I think a precondition of doing that is that regions need to develop a robust self-narrative that they can then sell to others, but in the first place a self-narrative about how they fit and how they want to fit within global production networks. So how does one go about building a sort of positive, productive ecosystem? Obviously not easy, but I think in the first place, this is obviously international research and involves countries and regions with very different degrees of regional autonomy, involves some very centralized states, some much more federal states, as well as obviously including more liberally orientated and somewhat more coordinated oriented, at least regions, if not always countries. I think the first thing to say is that I think regions need to do the thinking themselves. So I don't think a sort of centrally driven, central government-driven idea of this part of the country does this and the other part and another part of the country does something else. I'm not convinced of as a way forward. So I think it does involve regional actors getting together, talking and doing the thinking themselves. This requires a sort of iterative and continual process, so it's not a one-off thing, it's something that, that needs to be continual. A process of dialogue across the various ecosystem actors within the regional business system. And interestingly, this is one of the more sensible ideas that's come out of the European Commission in the last few years. Is the idea of smart specialization within regional innovation systems has at its core this idea that regions need to develop a narrative themselves, need to develop ideas themselves about where they can develop some form of comparative advantage. Now, if I was to, I think the first and most important thing to say here is that in order for any of this to happen, people need to talk to each other. And almost any way, not quite any way, but almost any way which encourages different sorts of actors to engage in dialogue is a good thing. And so policymakers, region, state, governments, etc., should be providing whatever nudges they can, which the types may vary in different places, to those sorts of dialogue. So obviously, in places like Quebec, which have a fairly densely institutionalized regional business ecosystem, one has the possibility of building upon an existing dialogue that already exists. So in some cases they may be regional, in other cases provincial, and in some cases more sectorally oriented. And I would say in places where the institutions are less developed, the encouraging of people to talk is sort of so important that it's almost the actual things that you create are the actual substantive thing that you're trying to achieve with the dialogue is almost less important than having the dialogue in the first place. So finding ways of getting people in a room together talking about issues of development. Secondly, there's a large element of training, and again that should really be in some sort of scare quotes, an element of training or socializing the unit managers of multinationals to make the regional case. So there's a paper from a separate but related project on multinationals in Canada, lead authored by Jacques Bollinger, which sort of differentiates multinationals according to sort of their embeddedness within their local and the Canadian national economy, and the extent to which managers engage with whatever surrounds them in the local environment. And there clearly are differences between firms here. There are firms where it's not going to work in any circumstances, but there clearly are different possibilities in different places for getting managers to think not just in terms of the global firm and the incentive systems and disciplinary systems which exist within the global firm, but for doing things off their own bat for the local plant, for the local unit, for the national subsidiary. And ways of teasing, we have to think, I think, of ways of teasing that out. Particularly in the area of developing unit strategies for competing for international mandates. So sometimes one can create circumstances within a regional business system, within a regional business ecosystem, where local unit managers can become quite innovative, can bid for new forms of investment, can achieve upgrading. So we have a case in Spain where what was originally a relatively simple manufacturing plant attracted by grants that were available in the late 80s, early 90s, managed to sort of manage to use the existing engineering expertise in that region in order to become a global research centre for a particular unit of business. So that process of upgrading, building on an institutional heritage. And thirdly, what you need to identify and encourage boundary spanners between different interest groups on the labour side, interest groups on the local capital side, interest groups in skills, education, etc. So very clearly, in our research and a number of other pieces of research show that network density in the regional ecosystem contributes to embedding MNCs. It's not a magic answer, but contributes to embedding multinationals. So normatively, one needs to use whatever identities exist in the local environment to build networks. So if there are strong geographical identities, one can deploy those. If there are feelings of industrial citizenship, as we found, I think, in some parts of manufacturing in England, on behalf of unit managers, then try to deploy those. Okay, so what levers can be used, and obviously talking across different countries and different regions, this is very much at the level of generality. So where there is patient capital for targeted upgrading, Gregor mentioned the worker investment funds in Quebec, which is one very good example, where available, should be protected and of course, need to be targeted on productive ecosystem development rather than short-term returns. I think it's important to stress that any sort of support, direct or indirect, for foreign direct investment needs to pass, whether we make a noise about it or not, needs to pass some sort of good jobs test, which, you know, the creation of good jobs leads to the creation of more good jobs, if you like. So it can create some sort of virtuous circle for the attraction of future high value added investment. I think focal actors such as regional development agencies, who often do a lot of the coordination in the middle of this system in most places, need to have some autonomy from electoral politics, and they also need to have autonomy from the sort of excesses that we sometimes get of metrics and targets, need to have a bit of space to pursue institutional entrepreneurship. And finally here, governance and social actors need to develop and need to deploy a very granular understanding of the economics and business strategies of specific global production networks and large firms. So, as came up earlier today, I think we can't excessively concentrate at a level of generality. We have to look at what is going on in particular firms and in particular sectors or particular processes. So, to conclude, I think that the strategy needs to be reflexive. As I'm not sure if I plagiarized Gregor or Gregor plagiarized me, but we already said, as Gregor already said, there's no magic recipe here. It is and one thing that we need, you know, because this is an unfair game, because the attraction of FDI and the retention of FDI is, you know, is a game that's not possible to control very fully at all. It's important that regional strategies are robust enough to transcend and learn from individual failures. So firms will dislocate no matter how good your system is. Things will go wrong no matter how good your system is. So institutions need to develop the capacity to anticipate some of these failures and deal with them. And finally, one last thing I want to say, the sort of experimentalism, the sort of positive ways of competing in the global economy, which come across in some of the experimental governance literature, require confidence building. They require institutional actors in particular to have some degree of underlying security, some degree of underlying stability. So we need to know that the institution that we're dealing with isn't going to be abolished in 2 years if the election goes wrong or something like that. And needs actors to be able to develop the capacity to think outside their traditional and primary roles, and to be able to think more broadly in terms of the regional ecosystem. That's all I want to say. Thank you.